All right, we're going to get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second presentation of Steep Rock Association's Winter Speaker Series. Tonight's talk is on Land Conservation 101, the why and how to property protection. My name's Brian Hagenbach, and I serve as Steep Rock's Executive Director. Just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our speakers tonight. We'd appreciate if you could please keep your Zoom muted to reduce extraneous noise. Hopefully you don't hear my dog chewing on his bone right now. Given the number of participants, I encourage you to put any questions in the chat box. We will field questions at the end of the presentation, and I'll moderate those for our speakers. We will also be recording this event if you're interested in a copy. Tomorrow, we will be sending out a short questionnaire asking for some feedback on the presentation, and we'd appreciate your input as we plan future events, whether they're these or others. We do have 2 remaining talks in our series, just in time for the spring gardening season. On March 28th, Patrick Horan of Waldingfield Farms will give a talk on mastering sustainable and organic vegetable gardening. And on April 18th, John Markelon, who's the president of the Litchfield Land Trust, will be presenting on establishing pollinator pathways in your backyard. You're more than welcome and invited to join us for those 2 talks. Finally, I want to recognize and thank National Iron Bank for their sponsorship of Steep Rock's conservation education programs, as well as our supporters and donors who enable us to provide these programs at no cost to you. So now I'd like to turn the program over to Rory Larson, Steep Rock's Director of Conservation, and Connie Manes, Director of the Litchfield Greenprint Collaborative and Kent Land Trust, for tonight's featured programs. Rory, it's over to you.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you all for tuning in this evening to review what's in store. We'll do some quick introductions, discuss Steep Rock's preservation efforts, and dive into the how component of land protection, looking at types of transactions, the processes that go into them, documentation requirements, as well as land trust responsibilities, and then contemplate the why. Why preserve my private property? What are potential benefits to me as a landowner, my community, and conservation initiatives both locally and regionally? Lastly, we'll leave time for a Q&A. So as Brian said, if you have questions during the presentation, please keep them in mind or jot them down, and feel free to ask away at the end. So as Brian said, I'm Rory Larson, Director of Conservation Association. I have a background in wildlife ecology and have been with Steep Rock a little over 10 years now, applying that scientific foundation to our stewardship, preservation, and outreach efforts. And I am so pleased that one of my role models is speaking with us tonight. Connie Manes wears many hats in the land trust community. She's a private consultant, executive director of the Kent Land Trust, and joining us as director of the Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative. And to introduce you to Steep Rock Association, we are a nonprofit land trust based in the town of Washington in Litchfield County of Northwest Connecticut, with the mission to conserve ecologically and historically significant landscapes and riparian corridors, and to enhance the community's connection to nature. Steep Rock was founded in 1925 with an initial 186-acre tract on the Chappaq River, and now as we're nearing a century of conservation, our protected land total approximately 5,800 acres, 3,000 that we own and manage, with roughly the other half in conservation easement, and we'll discuss the difference between these 2 shortly. I expect some of this webinar are familiar with our 4 nature preserves and their extensive trail systems open to the public. Those are Steep Rock, Hidden Valley, Macrocostas, and West Mountain, as you see showcased in the photos. And while much of our work focuses on managing these special places for wildlife, plants, people, and overall environmental health, it all starts by partnering with conservation-minded landowners to get them protected in the first place. And it's important to recognize that we are an accredited member of the Land Trust Alliance. So whether it's transactions or subsequent stewardship, we are held to very high operational standards and certify our conservation excellence every 5 years. As I mentioned, protecting land is really at the core of what we do, and it's done strategically with a focus on areas of high conservation value. And you may have heard this term, conservation value, that collectively refers to a property's key attributes or uses that are valued for protection. So for Steep Rock, we are very interested in the list you see here. Places able to maintain biodiversity and ecological function as the climate changes, as well as those that allow populations of flora and fauna to move freely from certain climatic stressors. Places that are known to support threatened wildlife or are likely to based on their habitat composition. Large expanses of unfragmented forest or core forest and connectors between them. Land that protects water quality and sensitive aquatic environments such as streams and wetlands. Opportunities for expanding existing trail systems or bridging the gap in regional networks, as well as places that provide scenic viewsheds and natural surroundings. And finally, working lands such as farms and managed forests that support the local production of goods while providing ecosystem services. As part of a recent prioritization process we went through, we analyzed all these different areas, honing in on properties that would expand protected lands, further corridors of natural systems and recreational greenways, or those otherwise situated in size to strongly influence an area's ecology. When a piece of the puzzle enlarges or connects intact conservation lands, its preservation is that much more impactful, in that contiguous lands work with one another on a landscape level, and in aggregate, the benefits provided are immensely magnified. So the map on the right shows protected areas in Washington and reflects these preservation priorities of Steep Rock. You can see projects completed in the past 6 years highlighted in red, which have protected riparian areas along the Chappaqua and Bantam rivers. They've grown our largest preserves, those in olive green, and developed our newest preserve open to the public, West Mountain, through the purchase of active farmland in the southeast corner of town. Now let's get into the how property is protected through a land trust. So there are two main types. First is a fee title transaction, or sometimes referred to as fee simple, where ownership of the property is simply transferred via deed. And the second is conveying a conservation easement on the land. Here, the private landowner retains ownership, but a legal agreement is made that restricts certain activities to protect its conservation value. This agreement runs in perpetuity with the property, even with future changes in ownership, and it's the land trust charge to ensure the purposes of the easement remain in effect and the conservation value protected. Both types, fee title and conservation easements, can apply to an entire parcel, or they can be isolated to just a portion of property. And as far as methods for accomplishing these acquisitions, they can either be gifted by the landowner as a charitable donation, purchased by the land trust at fair market value, or sold at a price lower than its fair market value called a bargain sale. And this difference between the sale price and fair market value is considered a charitable contribution as part of that bargain sale. So if I'm a landowner and considering conserving my property, where do I start? Every individual, family, and property scenario is unique, and it's important to begin by carefully considering short and long-term goals. Contact your local land trust, share these objectives, and provide details about your land. And depending on the situation, the trust may recommend an appropriate type and method of transaction, but it's certainly always advisable for landowners to confer with legal and financial professionals on how best to meet their interests. What's involved in the transaction process will vary to some degree, at least between organizations. But for Steep Rock, once we initiate a preservation project, we visit the property to document its conservation value, compile a report based on those field observations and research, and then go through an internal approval process to move forward. And once there, we start working on obtaining key pieces of documentation and performing the necessary due diligence. These include a survey clearly defining the subject area, investigation of title to confirm ownership and detect encumbrances, such as third-party rights, for example, and an appraisal valuing the property. All these things can take time, so I highly recommend landowners start a dialogue early, especially if they like to complete the transaction and, of course, celebrate the closing within a given calendar year. And I'll also note that purchases often require fundraising and seeking external grant support on our part, which can add to that expected timeline. And in such cases, there are contractual options that provide land trusts with a specified amount of time to raise those funds at an agreed upon sale price. For anyone interested in having an informational flyer that provides an overview of these transaction types, the planning process and documentation, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have that and we're happy to send it your way. There is documentation specific to conservation easements, which are important to understand for both creating new easements, but also for new landowners of existing easements. The deed of conservation restriction is the legal document recorded in town records that specifies the purpose of the easement and rights of the land trust to protect it. Importantly, it defines prohibited uses and reserve rights, which both the landowner and land trust agree to. Prohibited uses generally include things like subdivision, industrial use, surface alteration, pollution, other activities that are clearly inconsistent with the easement's purpose and are likely to adversely impact its conservation value. Meanwhile, reserve rights are activities allowed on the east area, which may include passive recreation, natural resource management, agriculture, and other uses desired by the landowner that are negotiated for inclusion into the deed. Depending on the activity, the landowner may be required to notify the land trust in advance, and for some, also obtain approval before exercising that right. And next is baseline documentation reports, often abbreviated to BDRs. And as implied, it's a report documenting the property's current condition at the time an easement is conveyed. And PDRs are a really valuable supporting document to an easement stewardship because they report on features subject to the terms of the agreement. They allow for detecting change over time, whether that be natural or human-made, and with very detailed descriptions, maps, and photographs, they are a great resource for new landowners to learn about the property's history and conservation value. When conserving a property, we in turn accept responsibility for its stewardship. And that oversight differs between an in-fee property and conservation easement in some ways, but is alike in others. When acquiring outright ownership, the property is added to our portfolio of nature preserves. We then invest in understanding its habitats, its wild inhabitants, and threats to natural communities. And from there, identify monitoring and management actions for the property's well-being. And to give you a sense of Steep Rock's management scope, this year alone, we're undertaking 9 biological studies, 4 natural community surveys, and at least 6 habitat enhancement projects on our preserves. And that's not to mention all the trail work and recreational infrastructure. Every year, we conduct a monitoring inspection on foot to detect changes in physical condition, look for encroachments, invasive plant species, as well as tree pests and pathogens. And every year, we also conduct a monitoring inspection for all 109 of our conservation easements, looking at the same things in addition to changes subject to the easement provisions. And remember, an easement runs in perpetuity, as does the land trust responsibility to protect it. So just think about that for a second and how incredible an assumption of duty comes with the word perpetuity. It's truly incredible. Steep Rock very much desires collaboration with landowners when it comes to easement stewardship, whether it's reviewing terms of the agreement, discussing a planned project, identifying habitat management opportunities maybe, or even just a joint walk around. We're all in this together in making conservation happen. So with that, I'd just like to transition to the second portion of our agenda on why land protection is so important to us as landowners, community members, and conservationists. by first sharing a testimonial from Jack Johnson, longtime landowner of the Johnson Farm, recently preserved by steep rock. So please bear with me for a second as we pull this up.
My name is Jack Johnson. It's now with Johnson Preserve of Steep Rock. I've lived here for 76 years. Feel very fortunate that this is my home. I was lucky enough to travel quite a bit when I was younger, so it's not like I've never been off and out. But this is always been home. And I mean, everywhere I go or look here, it evokes a memory of a child experience or some adventure that truly is a part of it. This property has had incredible effect on my life. And my two sisters feel the same way. And it's been very, very important to us since we're old enough to start thinking about it. What could we do with the property when my parents are gone to keep the land as it is? And we tried to figure out, subdividing it and this and that, and it was just not going to work for us. So we're very lucky to talk with Steep Rock, who's interested in acquiring land. That helped us out a great deal. And it's just euphoric for me, really, to have the knowledge that the property is going to be preserved as it has been and will stay that way forever.
Every time I gave property.
So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Connie Manes at this point.
Thanks, Rory. I actually am going to start sharing my screen. Thanks for showing that video. So hold on just while we get this going. Yeah, so I watched that clip actually before our session tonight, and what struck me is how poignantly Jack Johnson speaks about his deep connection to his land, really the joy and the comfort that he found in it throughout his life, his emotional knowledge that this land has sustained him while he held it and took care of it. It's an observation that many landowners who have experienced land with their families have had, and it can be tough to put into words because the connection is really so close and intimate. So a certain rock can loom large in our memories of childhoods where we jumped off that rock into snow or crouched behind it during hide and seek. Then maybe that rock became the turning place for the tractor or the place where the bobcat marks with his scat. Maybe it's the place where the morels come up, and then eventually it becomes the place where your kids and grandkids also jumped into the snow. When you love a place that much, its future stewardship really becomes significant. I think many of us in this room in Northwest Connecticut have worked really hard to, fight against invasive plants, maybe finally beat the stubborn multiflora rose or encourage the milkweed to flourish in the yard. With everything that we're learning about the changing climate and the struggle of our native species to find places where they can get the food that they need to eat and shelter to reproduce and raise their young, you know that what comes next on your land is an important part of the puzzle. And while a parcel may be small in the aggregate, and especially as it relates to its surroundings, it's really integral in how we do in the future. The entire community of living things benefits from that one property. It supports the local ecosystem and engages the people who care for it in making a better world. But best of all, this doesn't need to hit you in the pocket. And in fact, it can be a very helpful tool in your financial planning. Land has value, and so the sale or gift or a combination of these, as Rory laid out, recognizes that value by considering what you've given up, the diminution of value, as a charitable contribution. And if you're interested in protecting your land, it's worth talking to your tax planner about how this might work for you, and the timing and the structure that's optimal. So if I can see my arrow. Rory and Brian asked me to be here tonight to kind of illustrate how land trusts in different communities throughout Northwest Connecticut are working together to make sure that our land protection coordinates. We all know that land ownership and parcel lines are a human construct, and that plants and animals do not recognize when they've stepped off the Johnson farm to the next property over. Nature doesn't conform to town boundaries, and so our vision for conservation shouldn't either. Here in Connecticut, we have a really vibrant and thriving system of local-based land trusts where dedicated volunteer boards work to conserve land of important value within their communities. So how then can we have an impact that makes regional sense while staying true to that local nature? The Litchfield Hills Greenprint Collaborative has since 2008 been a trailblazer in the emergence of regional conservation partnerships, which are networks of organizations that work together to make a broader impact consistent with the local missions. The Greenprint is supported by the Housatonic Valley Association, which provides 4 staff, including myself, with expertise in GIS, in doing conservation projects, and in boosting organizational capacity. And they provide these services to the Greenprint's 33 partners, which adds to the strength of all of those 33 partners, paid and unpaid personnel. So many volunteers, many staff working throughout this network. I've actually been pretty conservative, I think, in saying 150 plus experienced practitioners. It's far greater. The collective knowledge and workforce of this partnership is just truly amazing. The Greenprint partners meet frequently to share insights and news, and we collaborate on projects and programs like this. Relevant to this presentation, we're working together towards an even larger goal, one that spans 4 states, and that is known as Follow the Forest. So the maps that you can see on this slide, on the left-hand side, kind of the green outline kind of shows where the partners in the Greenprint Collaborative are working. Just to orient you, in case you're curious, the blue line is the Housatonic River watershed, and the red line is the Appalachian Trail. But then moving over to the right-hand side of the slide, this map kind of shows the very large landscape plan of the Follow the Forest initiative. The Follow the Forest initiative's goal is to protect and connect a forested, climate-resilient wildlife corridor from the southern Hudson Valley all the way up to Canada. Follow the Forest really incorporates climate science, including existing data and predictive modeling, to show where wildlife can and need to move now and in the future. We look at the resilient habitat of our core forests and the connections between those core forests with a goal of protecting at least 50% of each core and at least one viable connection between each. So it's really super to see core forests and those connecting linkages as priority criteria in Steep Rock Association's strategy. Very happy to see that, Rory. We will reach our goal through several different strategies. The first is related to land conservation. So we've mapped the areas of core forests locally as priority places for future conservation so we can be strategic and proactive in our work. We've also sussed out where we think the wildlife crossing areas are, the connectors between those forests. And in the map on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of those purple blobs. Okay, so we're rewinding just a bit. The green blobs are core forests, and the purple blobs are the connectors in between them. And the difference between the connecting areas, the linkages that are hollow versus the linkages that are kind of shaded in, is that the linkages that are shaded in have actually been ground truthed by volunteers who went out to the roads and to the linkages and, checked out whether or not they're actually viable connectors. So community volunteers have examined the edges of crossing areas, looking at where there are roads, are there guardrails that might impede wildlife crossing? Is there vegetative cover that protects animals that cross there? Can terrestrial species use culverts or go underneath bridges? And where we find barriers to a safe linkage, what can we then do to manage that land there to make it more feasible for wildlife to pass? So, again, I just want to congratulate and emphasize the partnership of the Steep Rock Association in, kind of working collaboratively towards this goal. Steep Rock was instrumental in getting all of the linkages in Washington assessed. So just in summary, before I come off when we do Q&A, we've found really great benefit in working together as partners within the Greenprint on aligned goals. And Steep Rock's been a pivotal partner in this, contributing to the regional vision, really working hard within its own local area to implement that. And I'm super grateful to you, Steep Rock, for putting on this program and teaching people about how they can be involved in protecting land and how they can get involved in making their communities better places to live. So I'm going to come off share and we'll all be on screen so that we can do some Q&A or just get your thoughts on what you heard tonight.
Well, thank you, Connie, and thank you, Rory. I think that this was a nice combination in that we look at the local, and everything tends to happen on the local level and the local conservation of it. But Connie and the Greenprint put this really in a regional context across states and even into Canada, perhaps, so that what the actions that we take locally do impact regionally, because species do not understand town borders and state borders and things like that. And so we have to take that larger landscape scale opportunity. We have a couple of comments and questions, and please feel free to enter any questions that you have in the chat box. I think the first one is more of a recommendation. It says, I thought the presentation would be more about how to conserve your own property as a landowner, meaning stewardship. Will self-stewardship be covered in this presentation? And if not, should consider doing a presentation on that topic. I think it really starts with self-stewardship. If you listen to Jack Johnson's talk and that 5 generations on that farm and how they stewarded it, they protected it, they loved it, and they want to keep it that way forever. That's what inspires landowners to think beyond just their current generation to protecting it with a land trust or other conservation organization. Connie, Rory, you want to respond to that?
I did have one thought on that, Brian, and that is that while we didn't really focus on, the specific habitat types that you might want to encourage on your own land, that is really, one of the core observations of the Follow the Forest initiative is that, that there are core forests that we want to maintain, but they are split up. They are at this point fragmented. And so thinking about the linkages between them is really, what you don't want is you don't want a resilient area that is an island where, where species can't move in between. So an important facet of Follow the Forest is the management of developed lands so that wildlife can still pass. So to the extent that the asker was thinking about their property as a place where there is wildlife habitat, where they could encourage wildlife habitat, I would say that some of your other programs coming up, particularly the pollinator pathway one, is going to focus a little bit more on how to encourage the native plants that are going to produce the insects, that are going to feed the birds, that are going to allow for that kind of a healthy ecosystem that, that allows for that dynamic resilience.
Rory, Rory, did you have anything to add?
I just say that landowners who have an interest in stewarding their property for wildlife habitat or certain land uses, certainly a major driver and incentive for landowners to consider protecting their property. Working with conservation professionals and seeking guidance, as I mentioned in the conservation easement program. Really like to work closely with landowners and appreciate when they reach out and seek advice. And we always welcome those conversations.
Okay. A couple of questions have come up now. Is there a certain time of year when land trusts can enter into conservation easement agreements?
There is not a certain time of year. It happens year round. But I would say that timing becomes important when somebody who's donating a conservation easement is thinking about claiming a charitable deduction within a certain tax year. So that's where the timing enters into it. You would want to make sure that you could close on that conservation easement, that you could complete it all before the end of the tax year in which you hope to claim the charitable deduction. So what that means, especially, I guess what it means to me is it makes it doubly important to consult with your tax planner, because you kind of want to get a sense of when's going to be the best year. And if you know when the best year is going to be, to start early enough so that the land trust that you're working with can go through all of the different steps of transaction planning to make sure that they've done the due diligence and to give them enough time to be able to go for that board approval so that you can get it done. Different land trusts have different, guidance for when. But I would say that it would be helpful to know by maybe mid-year. By September would probably still work. But, this is not something that you can push through in the final weeks of December.
There's a staying on conservation easements. Is there an annual or one-time fee for easements? So, I guess in other words, what would landowners be responsible for, maybe paying for, if they want to put an easement on their land?
Well, Rory, do you want to answer that from Steep Rock's perspective?
Yeah, so Steep Rock, we talked about perpetual stewardship and the incredible responsibility associated with that. So when an easement is conveyed to us, we do request that a landowner donate to our stewardship and legal defense fund. Which enables us to, ensure the permanence of that annual monitoring. And down the road, if there, were violations that need to be addressed, we'd be able to financially support the protection of that easement.
Okay.
Sorry, Brian, just to add to that just a little bit, this is a little bit weedy, but you might expect as a landowner doing a donation of a conservation easement, you might expect that you'd have some expenses associated with legal fees. This is, real estate transactions. So you would want to be represented by counsel. And so certainly there's a cost associated with that. The other thing that, and this was on Rory's slide, but I'm not sure that we went deeply into it, is when a landowner is making a donation of a conservation easement and intends to take a charitable deduction or to make a claim for one, then what they need to do is to commission an appraisal to substantiate what it is that they're claiming was the value of their deduction. And so there would be an expense associated with getting that appraisal that goes in alongside your Form 8283, which is where you make your claim for a charitable deduction.
So how long does it typically take from the start of a conversation with a landowner to closing? And it can vary, I guess, with easements versus purchases, just with fundraising and things like that. But in general, from the start of the conversation to when you can close, do you have an average? I know in Steep Rock, we like to tell people at least 6 months.
Yeah, I mean 6 months, but it could be years also, and this goes back to the point about stewardship of one's own land. Jack Johnson probably didn't think about that for 6 months only. He was thinking about how to protect his land, throughout his life. And when it came time, that his parents were gone and he really did need to make some decisions, he said subdivision was out of the question. So, I would say, minimum 6 months, but people often think about these things for years, and the relationships and the conversations around what will happen to the land often grow over a period of years.
Yeah, and I had mentioned the informational flyer that we have, and that includes a breakdown of the timeline as far as the transaction process. So what we desire on our end as far as timing and when things are initiated, but beginning with that, first communication and the site visit, if it's going to happen in that year, usually we like to see things start around June 1st at the latest.
And if we're talking about a land purchase and we have to go to OSWA or state or federal funding, then we're talking about years, 2 to 3 years at least to close on those. So it does vary. I'm going to combine two of the questions. One is, can you explain what makes land worthy of conservation? And it adds that, and they assume a variety of land is important, fields, woods, agricultural land and such. And then, for example, what is a core forest and what is its benefit? So I guess combining them, it's what makes land worthy of conservation, regardless of the type of land, and then a definition of core forest.
I'm going to give to Rory for the first part of that question, especially coming back to Steep Rock Association's, project selection criteria.
Yeah, so certainly one of our valued conservation values for a property is critical habitat types for threatened wildlife. But as I had mentioned, kind of the value of a property is magnified when it's working in conjunction with already protected lands. Really it's a matter of getting on the site and seeing what's there often to, determine what's more worthy of protection.
And just specific to core forests, the Follow the Forest initiatives model really blocks out forest coverage of at least 250 acres, and they buffer back from any roadside by a certain number of feet. So basically, the concept is that core forests are more resilient to detrimental changes brought by climate change and by things like fragmentation. When you cut up a forest, you're more vulnerable to encroachment from invasive species, from parasitic, birds, from, I know that without more explanation. Maybe that sounds a little weird. There are certain birds that are, where nest predation is particularly bad on the margins of forest, as opposed to birds that are able to breed in the forest interior. So core forests have these attributes of climate resilience and nurturing and sustenance to wildlife species that are not as present in more disturbed areas. The other thing about core forests, of course, is in addition to supporting wildlife, they have these related benefits, like being able to filter our air and provide for clean air and clean water. Forests are amazing groundwater filters. And so have those really human benefits, as well as providing, in many cases, for recreational benefits through trail systems and all of the many opportunities to recreate, like Steep Rock provides in its preserves.
Okay. Does larger acreage of land, either woodland or working farmland, require additional endowments to conserve or donate? I imagine something like Johnson Farm Preserve must have been a large undertaking requiring additional cost and time from Steep Rock. So is the larger the property more expensive to protect? I think is the gist of the question. And I think, Rory, you touched on that with the Stewardship Legal Defense Fund, which is on easements. And because we use a formula to calculate that. So there is, the larger the easement, a little bit more added expense, because it goes, I think, on a per acreage basis. But maybe if you want to talk about conserving large properties and the investment, not just financial, but also to the organization.
I say there. I mean, with large acreage, there may be some additional costs as far as the preparation of the documentation, survey work, appraisals, environmental investigations, transaction screens, things like that. Yeah, certainly, if it's an in-fee transaction. As I said, one of our stewardship requirements is annual monitoring inspections of these properties. So the larger the property, the more staff resources are required to meet those accreditation requirements.
Yeah, and I would just add that, it really is very site specific and site dependent. So as you might imagine, our peers who are doing land trust work in more highly developed areas, if you kind of look south, I worked with land trusts in Greenwich and Ridgefield, and they do protect properties which trend on the smaller. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be less costly to steward and manage over time. There are different factors that argue to it being not just about the property's size. It may depend on how difficult the boundaries are to find and to monitor. It could, in some cases, be based on the degree of risk of encroachments or trespass from neighboring properties. It could depend on the various reserved rights or the contemplated activities that will continue to happen on that property. So it really does depend, and size would be one of the factors, but it wouldn't be the only factor.
Well, Connie, that was a nice segue to the next question, which flips that. What's the smallest parcel that a land trust is generally willing to accept? And is there a threshold at which a land trust would reject donated land or not place an easement on a property? And if not size, are there other factors that might cause a land trust to not want certain land?
Steve, have anything on that, Rory? Do you want to talk?
Well, you just addressed a good chunk of that, Connie. But No, I mean, it's all site specific, property specific. I wouldn't put a minimum number on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is very, very case specific. I think land trusts, just like any property, buyer or, potential property owner, would be looking to make sure that that there aren't liabilities, that would, basically prevent them from actually protecting the conservation values on the property. I mean, the point of this is, it's not a board game. It is very much the land trust's promise, and desire to take care of property, to make sure that the conservation values on it are protected forever. And so, if a land trust didn't feel that a certain transaction was feasible, or that stewardship, that they were going to be able to adequately steward the property, then, then they may, have pause, or they may, take a step back and say, are we doing this project the right way? Is there some other angle that we should be discussing with the property owner to make sure that what the property owner and the land trust want is achievable? And I think that that's a really important point, is that, there is some flexibility in this conservation work. And a lot of it is about the communications and the relationships that you build in putting together a land protection deal, so that you make sure that, that you really are honoring a legacy and a wish for, a wish that somebody's own stewardship ethic is preserved and carried forward over time.
So let's switch lanes. Is it possible, or is there precedence for a transaction to close that allows for lifetime use by the seller?
Yes. I mean, that sounds like a conservation easement to me. A conservation easement preserves private ownership in the donor, although, of course, there are restrictions. So, if you put a conservation easement on, the lifetime use doesn't include the lifetime right to develop the property. But there are also ways of donating one's property, donating fee ownership in property, and still retaining a lifetime use. These are transactions that are maybe a little, less common, and, like any other transaction, should be discussed, by legal counsel representing both parties.
Anything to add there, Rory?
No, I was thinking, as far as fee transaction, like Connie was saying, just thinking of one potential land use where it maybe not be addressed legally in a deed, but maybe in an agreement, a lease agreement. Agricultural lands would be a good one. Certainly something we're interested in. And if a landowner were to sell a property to us that's in active agriculture, certainly there may be an associated right of that seller to continue farming that land.
Yeah, that's where I've seen it most often as well. Often not just the right to continue farming the farm, but sometimes if a property has a house on it, which is extremely important to many farmers to be able to live in close proximity to the land that they're farming. I have seen where the land has been protected, but the farmer continues to live in the house.
We're almost up, so if anybody has a last question or two, pop it in. We do have a comment. Connecticut was once mostly forested. Forests were cut down during European settlement, and they grew back when lots of people left in the 19th century. Thus, we have the stone walls found in the woods. And I'll add that there's over 100,000 miles of stone walls in New England. So Connecticut is now much more forested than in earlier times in its history. And I'll add there that I think I just saw a statistic that Connecticut is the fourth densest population in the country, but we've also got the fourth highest percentage of forest per land area in the country. So an interesting dichotomy there. So they were reflecting a bit on the forests in New England. And then they had a comment that really it's connecting the easements that is important. And I think that was at the root of some of our conversation, especially around linkages. You know, if it's an isolated parcel that we don't see connections to other protected lands, then it's a little less of a priority for us, you know, to protect overall. But we're trying to kind of link those islands together. That allows for wildlife movement, potential recreational trails, the pollinator pathways to move through. And so it's really those linkages now that are becoming even more critical as we protect the land and look at it on a landscape scale. So Connie, Rory, comments on the forest or connecting these islands together?
I'd say conservation easements and nature preserves go hand in hand. I mean, they both have conservation values that are protected, and those protection measures limit things like development, which reduces fragmentation and enhances connectivity. So they're both certainly valuable in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We need every tool in the toolbox. Many of you are aware of the really bold goals for conservation nationwide. And if we're ever going to meet those goals, we're going to need everything that it takes. We can't really, I don't think that we could ever really imagine that it would all take place through direct ownership by land trusts of the land that needs to be conserved. And I don't know that that's the best thing anyway, given how many, people like Jack Johnson that we have out there who, really want to do the best thing on their land while they have it. So conservation easements are important. So linkages are important. So even if your land isn't preserved, thinking about how it can best support the local ecosystem is important. And go Connecticut, with its resurgence of forests. I mean, I've seen photos of when our hillsides were, with no trees, and that I prefer it now, and I'm glad that we've come back from that. And I think there's more to do.
I think the beauty of land trusts and nonprofit conservation organizations is that, this is really a true public-private partnership. Our lands, the 3,000 acres that Steep Rock has, is privately held. We are the private owner of these lands. 80% of our land, though, is we make open to the public. And so they can use it for recreation, for study, for exercise, to relax, to study nature. And the public partnership also, because of the value of land and its expense, that there's public funding available that we can purchase the land and put it into private ownership that then is available to the public. And so I think that it's that partnership, because if we had to raise the money from scratch on our own, there'd be a whole lot less land protected in Connecticut, where land values are so high. I'm getting lots of thank yous to this panel for it. I want to thank everybody who's attended tonight. And I hope you are very interested in collaborating on land conservation and preservation. If you're interested in your own land, thinking about it for easements or for a land donation, and you don't live in Kent or Washington, you can contact us, because we have a very strong collaborative network of land trust, and we can put you in contact with people in your local land trust in your community. But other than that, I want to thank Connie and Rory for this really enlightening, educational, and I think realistic approach to how and why we should protect our land. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. And with that, we will bring it to a close. Thank you, everybody.